Any further amendments to this title? We do have a resolution of the Blunt amendment that we're working on in a previous title, and I would ask unanimous consent that the Blunt amendment, number 1, as amended, be agreed to and inserted in the appropriate place in Title 4. Mr. Blunt, do you want to say anything?
I thank the chairman for taking time to work through this. I just want to express appreciation to Ms. Eshu and Mr. Gett for believing that we could work this out, and to you, Mr. Markey and Mr. Pallone, for being willing to take the time to work it out. Certainly Mr. Weiner and Mr. Ross, who understands these pharmacy issues better than any of us, were helpful in working with the staff, and the staff worked hard to find language out of other regulations that they think clarify this amendment in the way it was intended. And I thank the chairman for the time we were able to take to get this done, and hope to see it included.
Mr. Blunt, we certainly will press for this compromise. There are other parties that have to agree to it because other committees have jurisdiction, but I think it's a good compromise, and we'll certainly do all we can to see it included in the bill. Without objection, that unanimous consent request is agreed to. The vote now comes on, in this title, the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. Vote now comes on reporting the committee print as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion's agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I would like to
let me ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming corrections. Mr. Barton requested a roll call vote on final passage of this title. You really want that? We're not asking for a roll call vote on the whole package.
We did that on every other title, except one that I forgot.
Okay. Well, gentleman requests it. Let's go through another roll call vote. This will be the last roll call vote that we'll have this evening, and before members scamper out of here, I want to extend my gratitude to everybody who stayed in what has been a 12-hour since our committee first was convened on both sides of the aisle. The patience and tenacity of all of you to work this through is very much appreciated and important for all of us. Especially also want to thank the Republicans for working with us to expedite the process of this bill by agreeing to time limits in consideration of amendments. We will now conclude this last title by a roll call vote. All those in favor of reporting the title out as amended will say aye. Those opposed will say no.
Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle.
Aye.
Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey.
Aye.
Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Aye. Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshu. Ms. Eshu, aye. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green.
Aye.
Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Aye. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps.
Votes aye.
Ms. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon.
Aye.
Ms. Harmon votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky.
Aye.
Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez.
Aye.
Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee votes aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, aye. Mr. Space. Mr. Space votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck votes no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes no. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bono Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Ms. Blackburn. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mrs. Scalise.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Then the clerk will tally the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 32, the nays were 11.
32 ayes, 11 noes. The motion's agreed to. I would now call up H.R. 629, and without objection, the text of H.R. 629 will be struck after Section 1 and replaced with the text of the 5 committee prints the committee approved as amended at today's business meeting, and the committee will order reported to the House H.R. 629. Any objection? Without objection, that will be the order. The chair will also call forward H.Res. 31, sponsored by Mr. Price from North Carolina. This measure expresses support for the designation of January 28, 2009 as National Privacy Day, and I'd ask unanimous consent that the committee approve this measure and order it reported to the House.
We have no objection.
Without objection, that will be the order. That concludes our business. We stand adjourned. Oh, Mr. Barton.
We would ask that the minority has the usual 2 business days to prepare minority views on the bills that have just been reported.
Without objection, that will be the order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That concludes our business. We stand adjourned.